In the humid depths of Mississippi's cotton country, where Spanish moss draped like funeral shrouds over ancient oaks, the Blackwater plantation stood as a monument to secrets that should have died with their keepers. The mansion's windows seemed to watch, its walls seemed to whisper, and locals swore they could hear crying in the night wind that swept across the abandoned cotton fields. For nearly 2 centuries, the truth about Colonel Thaddeus Blackwater's forbidden arrangement remained buried beneath layers of forged documents, burned records, and the collective silence of an entire county. In 2023, when Hurricane Ida's floodwaters receded from the old Blackwater estate, they revealed more than anyone had bargained for. Hidden beneath the mansion's collapsed east wing, archaeologists discovered a network of underground chambers that had been sealed since 1846. Chambers that contained not just human remains, but detailed records of a breeding program so systematic and cruel that it defied comprehension. The Colonel's secret affair was not a romantic scandal, but something far more sinister. A calculated system of genetic manipulation designed to produce children who would never question their bondage. Each generation of the Blackwater family had inherited not just wealth, but the terrible burden of maintaining this secret. They paid for it with madness, suicide, and a curse that seemed to follow them like a shadow. The mansion breathed with the weight of hundreds of souls who had lived and died within its walls, their voices finally demanding to be heard. What emerged from those flooded chambers would force America to confront one of its darkest chapters, a story of scientific cruelty disguised as plantation prosperity, where human beings were treated as nothing more than breeding stock in the Colonel's twisted vision of the perfect slave. This is the story the Blackwater family tried to erase from history. This is the truth that cost 3 generations their sanity, and finally claimed the mansion itself. Chapter 1. The Breathing House. 177 years ago, in a plantation house that locals claimed breathed with the souls of the dead, military correspondents noted an incident of unusual nature that required immediate burial in official silence. Colonel Thaddeus Blackwater and his wife Miranda vanished from all public records after December 1846, but their absence left scars that marked an entire community with trauma so deep it passed through generations like inherited sin. The empty rooms of Blackwater Plantation echoed with voices that should have been forgotten, but refused to die. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The Mississippi Territory of 1846 was a landscape carved from blood and ambition, where cotton fields stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed perpetually stained with sorrow. In Jefferson County, where the humid air hung thick with the weight of unspoken horrors, the Blackwater estate rose like a Gothic cathedral dedicated to human suffering. The 3-story mansion, with its imposing columns and perfectly manicured gardens, presented itself as the pinnacle of Southern gentility, but those who lived nearby knew better. They spoke in whispers of lights that moved through empty rooms, of crying that drifted across the cotton fields on windless nights, and of a house that seemed to expand and contract like a living thing drawing breath. Colonel Blackwater had arrived in Mississippi in 1823 with impressive military credentials and enough capital to purchase 1,500 acres of prime cotton land. His reputation as a decorated veteran of the Indian removal campaigns preceded him, and local society welcomed him with the enthusiasm reserved for those who brought both wealth and respectability to their frontier community. Within 3 years, he had constructed his mansion and established what appeared to be one of the most successful plantations in the region. By 1830, official records showed he owned over 200 enslaved individuals, a number that placed him among the wealthiest men in Mississippi. But there were inconsistencies in the official records that troubled anyone who examined them closely. The Colonel's slave registry required by Mississippi law since 1837, showed numbers that didn't match his tax declarations. Witnesses who attended social gatherings at the plantation reported seeing far more enslaved individuals than were officially documented. Local physicians noted an unusually high birth rate among the plantation's enslaved population, combined with mortality rates that seemed to fluctuate wildly from year to year. Most disturbing of all were the recurring reports of children who bore striking resemblances to the colonel himself, resemblances that became impossible to ignore as the years passed. The house itself became a source of local folklore that mixed genuine fear with reluctant fascination. Visitors described rooms that seemed to shift and change between visits, hallways that led to spaces that shouldn't exist, and a pervasive sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The mansion's architecture incorporated elements that served no apparent decorative or practical purpose. Hidden staircases, rooms without windows, and a basement that extended far deeper than any building in the region required. Local craftsmen who worked on the original construction reported being sworn to secrecy about certain aspects of the building's design, and several left the area entirely rather than complete their contracted work. By 1845, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Circuit court records from neighboring counties contain references to irregular procedures at the Blackwater plantation, and correspondence between local officials suggests mounting pressure to investigate the colonel's operations. But before any formal inquiry could begin, the winter of 1846 brought events that would silence the investigation forever and leave questions that haunted Jefferson County for generations to come. Chapter 2. The Colonel's Laboratory. The Blackwater Mansion's eastern wing contained rooms that served no purpose any respectable planter would acknowledge. Spaces equipped with examination tables, detailed record-keeping systems, and medical instruments that belonged in a physician's office rather than a family home. In these chambers, Colonel Blackwater conducted what he called his agricultural experiments, a euphemism that barely concealed a systematic program of human breeding designed to create enslaved individuals who would be psychologically incapable of rebellion or escape. The colonel's military background in logistics and his obsession with efficiency had found their perfect expression in the methodical dehumanization of the people he claimed to own. Documents discovered in the flooded basement revealed the terrifying scope of Blackwater's operation. His handwritten journals, preserved by some miracle of moisture and circumstance, detailed breeding charts that traced genealogies back 3 generations. Each enslaved individual was assigned a numerical designation and categorized according to physical characteristics, intelligence assessments, and psychological profiles. The colonel paid particular attention to what he termed docility factors, personality traits that made individuals more or less likely to resist authority. The journals revealed that Blackwater had been corresponding with prominent scientists and physicians throughout the South, sharing his findings and requesting advice on methods to enhance his program's effectiveness. Letters from Charleston, Richmond, and New Orleans showed that his work was part of a broader network of plantation owners who viewed enslaved individuals as subjects for genetic experimentation. These men saw themselves as pioneers of a new science, applying principles of animal husbandry to human beings with the cold calculation of researchers studying livestock. Central to Blackwater's program was his belief that intelligence and rebelliousness were inherited traits that could be bred out of enslaved populations over time. He maintained detailed records of which individuals showed signs of independent thinking, literacy attempts, or resistance to authority. These people were separated from the general population and subjected to what the colonel euphemistically called corrective measures, punishments designed not just to modify behavior, but to prevent them from reproducing. The colonel's own participation in the breeding program became increasingly apparent as his journals progressed. By 1840, he was systematically forcing himself upon enslaved women he had selected for specific genetic characteristics. His records show a chilling clinical detachment as he documented these assaults, noting dates, outcomes, and the physical and mental characteristics he hoped to see in the resulting children. The colonel viewed these children as his property in the most literal sense, not just legally but genetically. The mansion's hidden rooms served as nurseries for these children, who were raised separately from both the main household and the general enslaved population. Blackwater's journals describe a careful indoctrination process designed to create individuals who would view their enslavement as natural and inevitable. These children were taught to read and write, skills that were forbidden to other enslaved individuals, but only so they could assist in maintaining the colonel's detailed records and help manage other enslaved people. What emerged from the flooded chambers was evidence of a systematic program of psychological manipulation that accompanied the physical breeding experiments. The colonel had developed what he called conditioning protocols, methods of breaking down individual identity and replacing it with absolute submission to authority. Children in his program were raised without knowledge of their parentage, given numerical rather than personal names, and taught to view themselves as fundamentally different from and superior to other enslaved individuals. By 1845, Blackwater's journals revealed growing paranoia about discovery and increasing instability in his experimental population. Several of his specially bred individuals had begun showing signs of psychological breakdown, and there were incidents of violence that threatened to expose the entire operation. The colonel's final entries show a man consumed by the monster he had created, desperately trying to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. Chapter 3. The Vanishing. December 15, 1846, marked the last documented appearance of Colonel Thaddeus Blackwater and his wife Miranda in any official capacity, a Christmas social gathering that neighbors would later remember as disturbing in ways they struggled to articulate. Guests reported that the colonel seemed agitated throughout the evening, constantly checking his pocket watch and excusing himself for extended periods. Miranda, normally the picture of Southern hospitality, appeared pale and withdrawn, speaking in whispers and starting violently at unexpected sounds. Most unsettling of all were the sounds that drifted through the mansion during the evening, crying that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, and the persistent impression that the house was overcrowded despite the relatively small number of visible guests. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The investigation that followed their disappearance revealed inconsistencies that local authorities seemed eager to overlook. The Blackwater plantation's overseer, a man named Samuel Hodge, claimed that the colonel and his wife had departed suddenly for urgent business in New Orleans, but no records of their passage existed on any riverboat or stagecoach line. Their personal belongings remained undisturbed in their bedroom, including jewelry and documents they would never have left behind for an extended journey. More disturbing were the changes observed in the plantation's enslaved population in the days following the couple's disappearance. Neighbors reported seeing individuals they had never encountered before working in the fields, people who seemed confused about basic plantation routines and appeared to be in various states of physical and psychological distress. The numerical count of enslaved individuals on the property fluctuated wildly from day to day, with some observers reporting far fewer people than the plantation's records indicated, while others claimed to see more than could reasonably be housed in the known quarters. Samuel Hodge's behavior during this period raised additional questions that were never satisfactorily answered. The overseer, who had previously been known for his meticulous record-keeping, claimed that most of the plantation's documentation had been destroyed in a fire that no one else remembered witnessing. He produced hastily written papers that supposedly accounted for the transfer of various enslaved individuals to other plantations, but these documents contained errors and inconsistencies that suggested they had been created after the fact. Local physician Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who had been called to the plantation several times during 1845 to treat various ailments among the enslaved population, reported strange observations that he had been reluctant to discuss publicly. He described encountering individuals who seemed to suffer from what he called peculiar mental disturbances, a combination of intelligence and docility that struck him as unnatural. Some patients exhibited knowledge and vocabulary that suggested education, yet displayed an absolute unwillingness to discuss their circumstances or express any desire for freedom. The mystery deepened when circuit court officials attempted to conduct a formal inventory of the plantation's assets in early 1847. What they found defied easy explanation. The mansion's eastern wing had been sealed with bricks and mortar, creating an impenetrable barrier that would have required significant time and labor to construct. The official records noted this alteration, but offered no explanation for who had ordered the work or when it had been completed. Local masons denied any involvement in the project, and no payment records could be found for such extensive modifications. Perhaps most tellingly, the investigation revealed that the Blackwater plantation's financial records showed payments to physicians, suppliers, and craftsmen that far exceeded what would be necessary for normal plantation operations. These expenses suggested a complex operation involving specialized equipment, medical supplies, and construction projects that went far beyond cotton farming. Yet when officials attempted to locate the recipients of these payments, they found that many of the named individuals had either left the area or claimed no memory of working for Colonel Blackwater. The official conclusion of the investigation was that the colonel and his wife had fled the state to avoid unspecified debts, and that the plantation would be sold to satisfy their creditors. But local residents knew better. They had seen too much, heard too much, and felt too much to accept such a simple explanation. The truth was that Blackwater Plantation had become something that defied official documentation, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had been crossed so many times that it no longer held meaning. Chapter 4. The Sealed Wing. For nearly 8 decades, the eastern wing of the Blackwater Mansion remained sealed behind brick walls that locals came to view as a necessary barrier between the living world and whatever horrors lay beyond. 3 generations of Blackwater descendants inherited the plantation, and each found ways to avoid acknowledging what their patriarch had left behind. The family's official records spoke of storage areas and unused rooms, but servants reported hearing sounds from behind the sealed walls, crying, whispering, and the occasional thud that suggested movement in spaces that should have been empty. The first attempt to breach the sealed wing came in 1924, when Colonel Blackwater's great-grandson, Edgar Blackwater, hired workers to renovate the mansion for his young bride. The renovation lasted exactly 3 days. Workers reported discovering rooms filled with medical equipment, examination tables, and filing cabinets containing documents that made them physically ill to read. The project was abandoned abruptly, with Edgar paying the workers significant sums to leave the property and never speak of what they had seen. Edgar's wife, Catherine, lasted 6 months at the plantation before fleeing to her family in Charleston, claiming that the house was haunted by the screams of children. Her departure marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the Blackwater family for generations. Wives who couldn't endure the mansion's atmosphere, children who grew up afraid of certain rooms, and a persistent sense that the family was paying for sins they hadn't committed but couldn't escape. The sealed wing seemed to exert a psychological influence that extended beyond the mansion's walls. Neighboring plantations reported unusual disturbances during the early decades of the 20th century. livestock that refused to graze in fields adjacent to the Blackwater property, dogs that howled incessantly when the wind blew from the east, and a persistent decline in property values that real estate agents attributed to atmospheric influences. Local archives from this period contain scattered references to the Blackwater situation, a phrase that appeared in correspondence between county officials, church leaders, and prominent families without ever being explicitly defined. These documents suggest that the community had developed an unspoken agreement to avoid discussing the plantation's history, even as that history continued to influence daily life in ways that couldn't be ignored. The Great Depression brought new pressures to the Blackwater family, as declining cotton prices and mounting debts threatened their ability to maintain the plantation. Edgar's son, Thomas Blackwater, considered selling the property but found that potential buyers consistently withdrew their offers after visiting the mansion. Real estate records from the 1930s show a pattern of initial interest, followed by sudden cancellations, often accompanied by vague references to structural concerns or atmospheric conditions. Thomas's own relationship with the sealed wing became increasingly obsessive as financial pressures mounted. Servants reported that he would stand outside the bricked-up entrance for hours, sometimes pressing his ear to the wall as if listening for something. His journals, discovered decades later, revealed growing paranoia about the family's obligations to maintain the seal, combined with desperate curiosity about what lay beyond it. The situation reached a crisis point in 1943, when Thomas attempted to secretly breach the sealed wing during a period when most of the household staff had been dismissed due to wartime labor shortages. His body was found 3 days later at the base of the mansion's grand staircase, having apparently fallen from the second-floor landing. The circumstances of his death raised questions that the coroner's report couldn't adequately address. Why was he found with brick dust on his clothing, and why were his hands torn and bleeding as if he had been clawing at stone walls? Thomas's death marked the beginning of the end for the Blackwater family's occupation of the plantation. His widow sold the property within months, accepting a price far below market value from buyers who promised to maintain the mansion's structural integrity. The new owners, a consortium of investors from New Orleans, seemed less interested in operating a plantation than in ensuring that certain areas of the mansion remained undisturbed. They sealed additional rooms, hired caretakers whose primary responsibility was to maintain the barriers that previous generations had constructed, and established trust funds to ensure the property's preservation in perpetuity. Chapter 5. Generations of Guilt. The Blackwater family's descendants scattered across the South after Thomas's death, but they carried with them a burden that no distance could ease. The knowledge that their prosperity had been built on crimes so systematic and cruel that they defied comprehension. Family letters from the mid-20th century reveal a pattern of mental illness, substance abuse, and early death that seemed to follow the bloodline like a genetic curse. Each generation produced individuals who spoke of nightmares featuring children's voices, of dreams that seemed more like memories, and of an overwhelming sense of guilt for sins they couldn't remember committing. Edgar Blackwater's grandson, Colonel James Blackwater III, served with distinction in World War II, but returned home profoundly changed by experiences that went beyond normal combat trauma. His military records, declassified in the 1990s, include psychological evaluations that noted his obsession with inherited responsibility and his conviction that his family owed a debt that could never be repaid. James spoke repeatedly of children who called to him in his dreams, asking why they had been abandoned and when someone would tell their stories. The family's women seemed particularly susceptible to what psychologists of the era termed hysteria, but which later generations would recognize as symptoms of inherited trauma. Catherine Blackwater, Edgar's wife, spent her final years in a Charleston sanitarium, claiming that she could hear crying from empty rooms and that children followed her wherever she went. Her medical records describe a woman consumed by guilt for events she couldn't possibly have witnessed, yet described with accuracy that disturbed her physicians. Financial records from the Blackwater estate reveal a pattern of charitable giving that seemed designed more to assuage guilt than to address specific social needs. The family established scholarships for African American students, funded historical preservation projects, and made anonymous donations to organizations working to document the history of slavery. Yet these efforts seemed to provide no relief from the psychological burden that defined their existence. The curse seemed to intensify with each passing generation. James Blackwater III's son, Robert, became an alcoholic before his 20th birthday and died in a car accident that witnesses described as deliberately suicidal. His daughter, Margaret, suffered from severe depression and spent most of her adult life in psychiatric institutions, claiming that she could see the faces of enslaved children in mirrors and that they were asking her to remember their names. Perhaps most tragically, the family's attempts to research their own history seemed to accelerate their psychological decline. Margaret's son, David Blackwater, hired genealogists and historians to investigate the family's past, hoping that understanding would bring some measure of peace. Instead, each discovery seemed to deepen his despair. His personal papers, donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives after his suicide in 1987, contain research notes that reveal the scope of his great-great-great-grandfather's crimes. David's research had uncovered evidence that Colonel Blackwater's breeding program had continued for at least a decade after his disappearance, managed by overseers and associates who maintained the systematic abuse under cover of normal plantation operations. Records from neighboring plantations showed transfers of individuals who matched the descriptions of Blackwater's specially bred population, suggesting that the Colonel's experiment had spread beyond the original location. The psychological impact of these discoveries on David was devastating. His journals described nightmares in which he was forced to witness the crimes his ancestor had committed, dreams that felt more like inherited memories than products of his imagination. He wrote extensively about his conviction that the family was cursed to carry the weight of their patriarch's sins until someone found a way to give voice to the victims who had been silenced. David's final act was to establish a trust fund dedicated to investigating the true history of the Blackwater plantation, with specific instructions that any discoveries should be made public regardless of their impact on the family's reputation. His suicide note, found beside meticulously organized research files, expressed hope that his death might finally break the cycle of inherited guilt that had claimed so many members of his family. He was wrong. The curse was far from finished with the Blackwater bloodline, and the truth that had driven him to despair was still buried beneath the mansion's flooded floors. Chapter 6. The Hurricane's Gift. Hurricane Ida's floodwaters receded from the Blackwater plantation in September 2023, leaving behind more than the usual debris of storm destruction. They had torn away nearly 2 centuries of carefully maintained secrets and exposed the truth that multiple generations had died trying to conceal. The hurricane's surge had risen high enough to breach the mansion's foundation, flooding the basement levels that had remained sealed since 1846. When the waters finally drained, they revealed chambers that had been preserved in an almost perfect state of suspended animation, complete with documents, medical equipment, and human remains that told a story more horrifying than anyone had imagined. If this story has captured you so far, leave a like. It helps Name of Person or Plantation Family to reach more people. The archaeological team that arrived in October 2023 was led by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in plantation archaeology from Tulane University, who had spent her career documenting the hidden histories of enslaved communities across the South. What she discovered in the Blackwater basement challenged everything she thought she knew about the systematic nature of slavery's cruelties. The flooded chambers contained filing cabinets with thousands of documents still legible after nearly 2 centuries, medical instruments that belonged in a laboratory rather than a plantation, and evidence of a breeding program so methodical that it resembled modern genetic research more than historical slavery. The documents revealed that Colonel Blackwater had maintained detailed records of over 400 enslaved individuals across 3 generations, tracking genetic traits, psychological profiles, and breeding outcomes with scientific precision. His handwritten journals contained genealogical charts that traced family lines back to Africa, noting which tribal backgrounds produced children with desired characteristics. The colonel had been particularly interested in individuals who showed high intelligence combined with what he termed tractable dispositions, people who could be trained to assist in managing other enslaved individuals while remaining absolutely loyal to their masters. Perhaps most disturbing were the medical records that documented systematic sexual abuse disguised as breeding experiments. The colonel had forced enslaved women to bear children according to his genetic specifications, then separated those children from their mothers to be raised in the mansion's hidden nurseries. These children were taught to view themselves as superior to other enslaved individuals, given education and privileges that created psychological bonds to their master while ensuring they would never seek freedom. The basement chambers contained physical evidence that corroborated the written records, examination tables with restraints, surgical instruments for procedures that had nothing to do with medical care, and a network of small rooms that had clearly served as cells for individuals who resisted the colonel's program. Most heartbreaking of all were the children's belongings found in the nursery areas, toys, books, and small personal items that spoke to young lives lived in captivity disguised as privilege. Dr. Mitchell's team also discovered evidence that Colonel Blackwater's program had continued long after his disappearance. The newest documents in the flooded files dated to 1856, suggesting that the systematic breeding and psychological manipulation had been maintained by associates who shared the colonel's vision of creating a permanent enslaved class. These later records showed that specially bred individuals had been sold to plantations across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, spreading the colonel's genetic manipulation throughout the region. The human remains found in the chambers told their own tragic story. Forensic analysis revealed the bones of at least 30 individuals, ranging in age from infants to adults, who had died under circumstances that suggested violence rather than natural causes. Many showed evidence of medical procedures performed without proper care, while others bore signs of physical trauma consistent with punishment or experimentation. The diversity of ages and the evidence of systematic disposal suggested that anyone who threatened to expose the colonel's program had been eliminated. Perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery of a hidden room that had apparently served as the colonel's personal office, containing his private journals and correspondence with like-minded individuals across the South. These documents revealed that Blackwater's plantation was part of a network of similar operations, with plantation owners sharing techniques and trading specially bred individuals to prevent inbreeding within their experimental populations. The hurricane had not just exposed the Blackwater family's secrets, it had revealed evidence of a conspiracy that involved some of the most prominent families in the antebellum South. The truth that emerged from those flooded chambers would force America to confront the reality that slavery had been far more systematic, scientific, and deliberately cruel than most people had ever imagined. The colonel's breeding program wasn't an aberration. It was part of a calculated effort to create a permanent underclass of human beings who would never question their bondage because they had been bred and conditioned to accept it as natural. Chapter 7. The Network Exposed. The correspondence discovered in Colonel Blackwater's private office revealed the existence of a sophisticated network spanning across the antebellum South, connecting plantation owners who viewed enslaved human beings as subjects for genetic experimentation and psychological manipulation. Letters exchanged between Blackwater and associates in South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama detailed breeding strategies, shared research on methods of psychological control, and documented the systematic exchange of specially bred individuals to prevent genetic complications within their experimental populations. This was not the isolated obsession of a single deranged plantation owner, but a coordinated effort involving some of the wealthiest and most respected families in Southern society. The network's correspondence revealed a chilling scientific approach to human bondage that anticipated techniques later associated with totalitarian regimes. Members shared detailed studies on breaking psychological resistance, methods for creating dependency relationships between masters and enslaved individuals, and techniques for identifying and eliminating potential leaders within enslaved communities. They viewed themselves as pioneers of a new form of slavery that would be psychologically sustainable rather than dependent on physical coercion alone. Dr. Mitchell's team identified at least 12 plantations that had participated directly in Blackwater's network, with evidence suggesting that dozens more had purchased or received individuals who had been subjected to the experimental breeding programs. The geographic scope of the conspiracy extended from Virginia to Texas, with particular concentrations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Financial records showed that specially bred individuals commanded premium prices at slave markets, with buyers specifically requesting people who had been trained in the Blackwater method. The network's members maintained detailed scientific records that rivaled anything produced by legitimate researchers of the era. They documented genetic inheritance patterns, psychological conditioning techniques, and the long-term outcomes of their breeding experiments with meticulous care. Some participants held advanced degrees from prestigious universities, while others had military backgrounds that provided them with organizational skills and access to resources that made their operations possible. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the network had developed what they called breeding contracts, formal agreements between plantation owners that specified genetic traits, training requirements, and financial arrangements for the exchange of enslaved individuals. These documents treated human beings as livestock, complete with pedigree charts, performance evaluations, and warranties guaranteeing certain behavioral characteristics. The psychological techniques developed by the network were sophisticated enough to create individuals who appeared to accept their enslavement willingly, while remaining completely unaware of the manipulation they had experienced. Children raised in the network's programs were taught to view freedom as dangerous and unnatural, masters as protective figures, and other enslaved individuals as inferior beings who deserved their fate. This conditioning was so effective that some individuals continued to defend their former masters even after emancipation. Evidence from the Blackwater archives also revealed that the network had infiltrated religious and educational institutions throughout the South, using churches and schools to reinforce their psychological conditioning techniques. Ministers and teachers who served enslaved communities were often recruited to deliver messages that supported the plantation owners' goals, presenting slavery as divinely ordained and resistance as morally wrong. This religious component gave the network's psychological manipulation a spiritual dimension that made it even more difficult for victims to recognize or resist. The network's operations continued well beyond the disappearance of Colonel Blackwater, with evidence suggesting that modified versions of their techniques were employed throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. Some members adapted their methods to create sharecropping arrangements that maintained psychological control over formerly enslaved individuals, while others used their conditioning techniques to influence labor relations in emerging industrial enterprises. The scope of the conspiracy raises profound questions about the nature of American slavery that historians are still struggling to answer. How many enslaved individuals were subjected to systematic breeding programs? How many families were destroyed by genetic experimentation disguised as plantation management? How many children grew up believing that their bondage was natural and inevitable because they had been conditioned from birth to accept it? The documents from the Blackwater plantation suggest that these practices were far more common than anyone had previously suspected. The network's records also documented their efforts to conceal their activities from abolitionists, government officials, and even other plantation owners who might disapprove of their methods. They developed elaborate cover stories, maintained false records for public inspection, and created financial arrangements that disguised the true nature of their operations. This systematic deception allowed them to continue their experiments for decades while maintaining their reputations as respectable members of Southern society. Chapter 8. The children who never were. The most heartbreaking discoveries in the Blackwater archives were the detailed records of children who had been born into the Colonel's breeding program. Individuals who were systematically stripped of their identity, family connections, and basic humanity from the moment of birth. These children existed in a horrifying liminal space between slavery and something even worse. They were raised to believe that their captivity was privilege, their isolation was protection, and their complete subservience was love. The Colonel's journals documented over 200 such children across 3 decades, each one assigned a number rather than a name. Each one conditioned to view freedom as a terrifying concept that threatened their very existence. The children were separated from their mothers within days of birth and raised in nurseries within the mansion's hidden chambers. They were fed better food, given better clothing, and provided with education that was denied to other enslaved individuals. But these privileges came at the cost of their souls. From their earliest moments, they were taught that they were special, chosen, and fundamentally different from other enslaved people. This artificial elite status created psychological bonds to their captors that were nearly impossible to break. The Colonel's conditioning program began with complete isolation from the outside world. The children lived entirely within the mansion's sealed wing, with no knowledge of life beyond its walls. They were taught that the outside world was dangerous and chaotic, filled with people who would hurt them if they ever tried to leave. The Colonel presented himself as their protector and benefactor, the only person who truly understood their special nature and could keep them safe from harm. Education was used as both privilege and prison. The children were taught to read and write, skills that gave them status over other enslaved individuals while binding them more tightly to their master. They were trained to maintain the Colonel's records, assist with his correspondence, and help manage other enslaved people. This education made them complicit in the very system that oppressed them, creating additional psychological barriers to resistance or escape. The conditioning program included systematic destruction of family bonds and individual identity. Children were taught that their mothers had abandoned them, that their fathers were unknown, and that the Colonel was the only family they would ever need. They were given numbers instead of names and taught to think of themselves as valuable property rather than human beings. This dehumanization was so complete that some children grew up believing that they were fundamentally different species from other enslaved individuals. Religious indoctrination played a crucial role in the psychological manipulation. The children were taught a distorted version of Christianity that presented slavery as divinely ordained and masters as earthly representatives of God's will. They were told that their special treatment was evidence of God's favor and that questioning their circumstances would be sinful. This religious conditioning created spiritual barriers to freedom that complemented the psychological ones. The Colonel's records documented the psychological breaks that occurred when children reached adolescence and began to question their circumstances. Some experienced what he called adjustment crises, periods of depression, anxiety, and confusion that required intensive reconditioning. Others simply withdrew into themselves, becoming increasingly passive and dependent. A few attempted to resist or escape, but these individuals disappeared from the records entirely, suggesting that the Colonel dealt with them permanently. Perhaps most tragically, the conditioning program was so effective that many of the children grew up to perpetuate the system that had damaged them. When they reached adulthood, they were used as overseers and intermediaries between the Colonel and other enslaved individuals. Their education and apparent privileges gave them authority over people who were often their own relatives, creating a hierarchical system that prevented unified resistance. The discovery of personal items belonging to these children, toys, books, letters they had written to the Colonel expressing gratitude for their captivity, provided heartbreaking evidence of the psychological damage inflicted by the breeding program. These artifacts revealed young minds struggling to make sense of their circumstances, creating elaborate mental constructions to explain why their isolation and subservience were actually forms of love and protection. The children's fate after the Colonel's disappearance remained unclear until Hurricane Ida exposed additional chambers containing records from the 1850s. These documents revealed that the surviving children had been distributed among other members of the network, where they continued to serve as specially trained enslaved individuals. Some were used to establish similar programs on other plantations, while others were sold at premium prices to buyers who valued their conditioning and education. The system the Colonel had created outlived him by decades, spreading his psychological manipulation techniques throughout the South. Chapter 9. Voices from the Flood. When the flood waters finally receded from the Blackwater Plantation's basement chambers, they revealed more than documents and artifacts. They had uncovered voices that had been silenced for nearly 2 centuries, stories that demanded to be heard, and truth that could no longer be buried beneath the weight of official silence. The archaeological team's most profound discoveries were personal letters, diary fragments, and testimony written by enslaved individuals who had somehow managed to document their experiences, despite the systematic efforts to erase their humanity. These voices spoke across the centuries with clarity that cut through decades of historical obfuscation and denial. Among the most powerful testimonies was a collection of letters written by a woman identified only as Sarah No. 7, one of the Colonel's specially bred individuals who had somehow learned to write despite the restrictions placed on her education. Her letters, addressed to children she would never see again, documented the systematic separation of families and the psychological torture inflicted on mothers who were forced to give birth to children they could never raise. Sarah's letters revealed the complex emotions experienced by women trapped in the breeding program: love for children they barely knew, hatred for the man who had created them, and desperate hope that someday their stories would be remembered. She wrote with heartbreaking clarity about watching her children disappear into the mansion's hidden chambers, knowing that they were being conditioned to view her as inferior and dangerous. Her final letter, dated just weeks before the Colonel's disappearance, expressed hope that someone someday will tell our children who we really were. The archives also contained fragments of testimony from children who had managed to escape the Colonel's conditioning long enough to record their experiences. These documents, written in careful script that revealed the education they had received, described the confusion and terror of discovering that everything they had been taught about themselves and their world was a lie. One fragment, written by someone identified as Thomas Number 12, described the moment he realized that the people he had been taught to manage and control were actually his own relatives. Perhaps most remarkable was the discovery of a hidden diary kept by Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the local physician who had been called to treat enslaved individuals at the plantation. His entries, concealed within medical records for his legitimate patients, documented his growing horror at what he witnessed during his visits to Blackwater. Dr. Whitfield had been forbidden to discuss his observations publicly, but his private writings revealed a man consumed by guilt for his complicity in the Colonel's crimes. Dr. Whitfield's diary provided crucial evidence about the physical and psychological damage inflicted by the breeding program. He documented cases of severe mental illness among women who had been repeatedly forced to bear children who exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma despite their apparent privileges, and adults who displayed the dissociative symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as responses to systematic abuse. The physician's records also revealed that several individuals had attempted to resist the Colonel's program, with consequences that were both swift and permanent. His entries described treating injuries that were clearly the result of torture, performing procedures that were designed to prevent reproduction rather than preserve health, and being present during interrogations that were designed to break psychological resistance rather than extract information. The flood had also preserved testimony from overseers and other white employees who had worked at the plantation but grown uncomfortable with what they witnessed. Their accounts, hidden among personal papers and financial records, provided crucial corroboration for the experiences documented by enslaved individuals. These witnesses described a system of abuse so systematic and calculated that it challenged their fundamental assumptions about human nature. The voices recovered from the flooded chambers painted a picture of resistance that had been invisible to previous historians. Despite the systematic efforts to break their spirits and destroy their identities, enslaved individuals at Blackwater had maintained networks of communication, preserved family stories across generations, and created elaborate plans for escape and rebellion. The Colonel's breeding program had not eliminated resistance. It had merely driven it underground. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Blackwater plantation. We'll see you in the next video. The testimony recovered from Hurricane Ida's floodwaters forced America to confront the reality that systematic abuse of enslaved individuals had been far more scientific, deliberate, and widespread than anyone had previously acknowledged. The voices from the Blackwater plantation spoke not just for themselves, but for thousands of other individuals who had been subjected to similar programs throughout the antebellum South. Their stories demanded recognition, justice, and most importantly, memory, the assurance that their experiences would never again be forgotten or denied.